Hi, folks. Welcome back to the never-ending reality show called American Politics, where Democrats preach unity by attacking regular, everyday Americans over an open flame. Today's headliner, Ilhan Omar, the pride and joy of the self-designated virtuous left, caught mocking those stupid Americans. You know, the same idiots like you and me who pay the salary of Congress people. Watching Democrats lecture anyone about intelligence is like asking Hunter Biden for sobriety tips. Hilarious, disturbing, and doomed from the start. So buckle up, grab your strongest drink, and let's enjoy this fresh serving of progressive hypocrisy, grilled to perfection.
These people are just idiots. I really, I'm at the point where it's become really hard to have an intellectual debate with any of these people because the level of stupidity that they are displaying every single day is frankly embarrassing, not just in Congress, but as Americans. And the fact that these people are allowed to say just the most ridiculous things tells you that the dumbing of the United States has arrived, because how else do we get a Trump presidency again?
Wow. Terrific display of political clownery courtesy of America's favorite philosopher, Ilhan Omar. Yep, she's back at it again, branding Americans as idiots while mourning the death of intellectual debate. Listening to Omar lecture anyone about stupidity is like getting relationship advice from O.J. Simpson. Sure, he might have strong opinions, but following them probably won't end well for all parties involved. Now, first off, notice how Omar dismisses her opponents as morons without even pretending to engage with her arguments. Classic ad hominem right there. She's basically saying, I'd love to debate, but unfortunately, everyone's just too stupid to appreciate how brilliant I am. I'm Ilhan Omar. I'm so great. Bold move from someone whose greatest intellectual contribution to politics is reducing every critique of herself to either racism or Islamophobia. Talk about nuance. It's like Jeffrey Dahmer lecturing us about veganism. Technically interesting, morally suspect, and extremely hard to swallow, especially if you know what he's giving you to swallow. Anyway, then Omar doubles down by lamenting the dumbing down of America, claiming that's how we got Donald Trump elected again as president. Really, Ilhan? Trump voters are all idiots. Maybe she forgot those pesky working class voters, the same ones her own party once pretended to care about, who rejected career politicians like Ilhan precisely because they're tired of being patronized by politicians like, well, Ilhan Omar. But in her world, nuance only applies when you're caught saying something anti-Semitic. Misinterpreted. And let's not gloss over the hilarious hypocrisy of Omar complaining about Americans being allowed to say ridiculous things. Oh, the horrors of free speech, allowing all sorts of people, including Ilhan herself, to say utterly absurd things like blaming American stupidity for her political woes. Someone should gently remind Omar that the First Amendment isn't a buffet. You don't get to pick and choose what speech you're comfortable digesting. Notably, it's also quite ironic that a sitting congresswoman would come out so strongly against freedom of speech. It's almost like she and her party have a vendetta against Americans having the right to speak their mind because, guess what? A lot of people don't agree with their lunacy. At the end of the day, Ilhan Omar's entire tirade is a performative tantrum disguised as intellectual critique, served up as a generous side of smug superiority. Classic Democrat appetizer. It's peak irony, a politician whose entire brand revolves around victimhood complaining about how stupid everyone is. Maybe next time Omar decides to lecture America about intellectual rigor, she should try actually practicing it, because right now she's got about as much credibility as a CNN fact checker. And speaking of people who hate America, next up we have Jane Fonda, aka Hanoi Jane, who gave this speech yesterday at the SAG Awards after receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award. I'm pretty sure it's going to be some level-headed, non-political type stuff, right? Because that's exactly what happens at these Hollywood functions.
It's okay to be a late bloomer as long as you don't miss the flower show. I'm a late bloomer. This is the flower show. Yeah. I love acting.
Oh, do you?
We get to open people's minds to new ideas, take them beyond what they understand of the world, and help them laugh when things are tough. like now. And for a woman like me, who grew up in the 40s and 50s when women weren't supposed to have opinions and not get angry, acting gave me a chance to play angry women with opinions, which, as you know, is a bit of a stretch for me, but I'm a big believer in unions. Yeah. They have our back, they bring us into community, and they give us power. Community means power, and this is really important right now when workers' power is being attacked and community is being weakened. Yes.
This bitch is retarded. Nah, but seriously, did somebody slip something into her drink? Why is she borderline incoherent? Anyway, thank you, Jane Fonda, for once again bravely taking the stage to remind all of us peasants just how heroic Hollywood millionaires truly are. Fresh off snagging a Lifetime Achievement Award at the SAG Awards, basically the Oscars participation trophy, Jane treated us to a deeply moving speech about being a late bloomer at the flower show. Cute metaphor, Jane, but calling yourself a late bloomer after half a century in the spotlight is like Hunter Biden claiming he's just experimenting. Sure, Jane, if by flower show you mean a self-congratulatory festival of hypocrisy, you're blooming beautifully. We kick things off with Jane enlightening us peasants about how actors open people's minds to new ideas and help us laugh through the tough times. Right. Because nothing lifts spirits during inflation and layoffs quite like a Hollywood multimillionaire explaining how acting saved her from the unimaginable trauma of being a rich, opinionated woman in the 1950s. This from the same Jane Fonda who once cozied up to North Vietnam, to open minds. Jane giving lectures on empathy is like O.J. Simpson hosting a marriage seminar, entertaining, morally bankrupt, and probably best avoided. Then, in a spectacular climax of virtue signaling, Fonda passionately endorsed unions, claiming they give us power and community, and whining about how workers' power is currently under attack. Fascinating stuff coming from someone whose greatest workplace risk is a lukewarm latte on set. Jane's idea of union solidarity is sipping organic Chardonnay at Beverly Hills fundraisers, bravely defending the oppressed Hollywood elite from the horror of slightly smaller private jets. She's about as convincing a champion of the working class as Jeffrey Epstein was a babysitter. But let's be real. Jane's speech wasn't about workers or solidarity. It was about the oldest Hollywood tradition. Celebrities desperately pretending to be relatable. Listening to Jane Fonda lecture us about workers' rights is like getting driving lessons from Ted Kennedy. You could do it, but I wouldn't recommend it. Next time, Jane, stick to what you know best. Posing dramatically and pretending your opinions matter. After all, acting is your flower show. Everything else, it's just the manure.
But SAG-AFTRA is different than most other unions because us, the workers, we actors, we don't manufacture anything tangible. What we create is empathy.
Oh, shut up.
Our job is to understand another human being so profoundly that we can touch their souls. We know why they do what they do. We feel their joys and their pain.
Here at the 31st.
And I can conjure up voices. We have to drill deep, don't we? We have to know, for example, if a young woman is cutting or she's a sex worker, there's a good chance that as a young girl she was sexually abused or incested, right? I'm thinking Bree Daniels and Clute. And I'm sure many of you guys have played bullies and misogynists. And you can pretty much know, you actors, right, that probably their father bullied them and called men that he felt were weak, he called them losers or pussies. And while you may hate the behavior of your character, you have to understand and empathize with the traumatized person you're playing, right?
Speaking of empathy, can we get an empathetic soul in that audience to walk Jane back to the nursing home? I think it's about time she get her diaper changed. Anyway, looks like Jane just blessed us again, delivering a sermon on empathy from the pulpit of SAG-AFTRA, also known as the union for multimillionaires who think playing dress-up is basically humanitarian aid. Jane, in her infinite Hollywood wisdom, tells us that actors don't create anything tangible, but instead produce empathy. Yeah, because clearly, before Hollywood came along, no one ever knew how to feel emotions unless Tom Hanks showed up and gently guided us through it. Thanks, Jane. Without you and your colleagues, we might never know how to cry properly at funerals. Then Jane decides to drill deep. Terrifying phrase coming from someone who once took propaganda selfies with enemy artillery and brilliantly psychoanalyzes real trauma using fictional movie roles as evidence. Her case study? Her own character, Bree Daniels from Clute. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Hollywood's leading therapist just diagnosed all sex workers and victims of self-harm as products of abuse because, hey, that was true for the one imaginary prostitute she played back in the Nixon administration. Using a fictional character as proof of real-world psychology is like O.J. Simpson citing his Hertz commercials as proof he's a safe driver. Entertaining? Maybe. Credible? Not exactly. But wait, it gets better. Jane casually suggests every bully or misogynist is basically damaged goods because their dads probably called weak men pussies. Got it. Every act of cruelty is clearly due to universal daddy issues. Forget genetics, poverty, or mental illness, or whatever else is going on. Nope. Jane cracked the code. Just blame dad. Apparently, Jane's idea of empathy means treating human complexity like an episode of Maury. You're traumatized, and you're traumatized, and everybody's traumatized. That's not empathy, Jane. That's lazy emotional voyeurism masquerading as wisdom. And let's not skip over Jane's bold claim that actors somehow touch people's souls. Really, Jane? Because if Hollywood actors are the soul-touching moral guides of humanity, we might as well ask Bill Cosby to bartend our next office party. If empathy truly were Hollywood's leading export, perhaps we wouldn't need an annual awards ceremony celebrating actors who bravely pretend to care about anyone other than themselves for 5 minutes at a time. Ultimately, Jane's speech was less about empathy and more about actors reassuring themselves that they're not just overpaid narcissists, they're deep, soulful, misunderstood narcissists. But Jane, the next time you feel compelled to lecture America about empathy, maybe look at your industry's stellar track record of exploitation and abuse first. Because honestly, Hollywood lecturing anyone about morality is like Jeffrey Dahmer judging a chili cook-off. Darkly hilarious, but disturbingly out of place.
Thinking Sebastian Stan in The Apprentice. Make no mistake, empathy is not weak or woke. And by the way, woke just means you give a damn about other people.
No, it doesn't. Stop it.
Back to empathy. A whole lot of people are going to be really hurt by what is happening, what is coming our way.
Come on.
And even if they're of a different political persuasion, we need to call upon our empathy and not judge, but listen from our hearts and welcome them into our tent, because we are going to need a big tent to resist successfully what's coming at us.
There's nothing coming at me. Wow. Jane Fonda just unleashed another sermon from the gospel according to SAG-AFTRA. And this time she's warning us about something terrifyingly vague that apparently is coming our way. Is it climate change? Fascism? Another Netflix price hike? Who knows? But clearly, it's scary enough that Jane had to interrupt her millionaires-only pity party to lecture us about empathy. You know, empathy, the stuff celebrities feel between sipping organic smoothies and lecturing working-class people about privilege. Jane confidently tells us empathy isn't weak or woke, then immediately redefines woke as giving a damn about other people. Oh, come on, Jane. Woke doesn't mean giving a damn. It means tweeting about injustice from your private jet while ignoring the homeless person outside your vegan yoga studio. But nice try on the emotional blackmail. Framing anyone who mocks woke as a heartless monster is about as subtle as a Will Smith slap at the Oscars. Then, in a masterstroke of Hollywood paranoia, Jane declares ominously that a whole lot of people will be hurt by what's coming. What exactly is coming, Jane? Trump is gonna post something on X? Joe Rogan is gonna ask an uncomfortable question again? Or worse, someone is going to disagree with a celebrity opinion on TikTok. Jane's vague fear-mongering is the intellectual equivalent of a drunk aunt claiming vaccines are full of microchips. Scary, confusing, and hilariously lacking in evidence. But wait, there's more. Jane wants us to welcome people of different political persuasions into our tent, presumably the tolerant Hollywood tent, where you're totally welcome as long as you shut up, agree, and never wear a MAGA hat. Jane calling for political inclusion is like Jeffrey Epstein advocating for child safety. Painfully ironic, morally questionable, and utterly tone deaf. Now, let's face it. Jane Fonda's definition of empathy isn't compassion, it's emotional bullying disguised as virtue. It's designed to guilt trip ordinary people into silence while celebrities lecture us from ivory towers built by sweatshops and tax loopholes. Empathy, according to Jane, apparently means nodding obediently when Hollywood elites claim to care about you from behind their fortified gates. But hey, if pretending the world is ending helps Jane sleep better on her sustainably harvested Egyptian cotton sheets, let's give her the Oscar she truly deserves for Best Actress in a Moral Panic.
I made my first movie in 1958. It was the tail end of McCarthyism, when so many careers were destroyed. Today, it's helpful to remember, though, that Hollywood resisted. We did. Overseas, brave American producers like Hannah Weinstein hired blacklisted writers. Myrna Loy, John Huston, and Billy Wilder founded the Committee for the First Amendment. They had a radio show on ABC Radio called Hollywood Fights Back. Members of the committee included every big-name actor in town. Have any of you ever watched a documentary of one of the great social movements, like apartheid or our civil rights movement or Stonewall, and asked yourself, would you have been brave enough to walk the bridge? Would you have been able to take the hoses and the batons and the dogs? We don't have to wonder anymore because we are in our documentary moment.
And you're on the wrong side of history.
This is it. And it's not a rehearsal. This is it. And we mustn't for a moment kid ourselves about what's happening. This is big time serious, folks. So let's be brave. This is a good time for a little Norma Ray or Karen.
Jane Fonda just took us all on a breathtaking journey through Fantasyland at the SAG Awards, channeling her inner freedom fighter to lecture us peasants on bravery. She starts by invoking the ghost of McCarthyism, claiming Hollywood resisted bravely. Let's set the record straight. Hollywood in the 1950s didn't exactly heroically resist McCarthyism as a unified front. In fact, most studios eagerly cooperated with the blacklisting hysteria to protect their bottom lines, tossing their own colleagues under the bus faster than Harvey Weinstein deletes text messages. Yes, a handful of courageous individuals like Hannah Weinstein and John Huston did resist, but Jane conveniently omits that many others folded faster than Kevin Spacey's career after Me Too. So spare us the revisionist fairy tales, Jane. Then Jane proudly mentions the Committee for the First Amendment, highlighting actors like Myrna Loy and Billy Wilder, who bravely stood up against censorship. Noble stuff, except she glosses over the inconvenient fact that this committee fell apart spectacularly after being publicly humiliated and accused of communist sympathies. Even Humphrey Bogart, initially a vocal supporter, backed away like Alec Baldwin at a gun safety class, desperately trying to save his own reputation. Hollywood loves celebrating heroes after the danger is past, but let's not pretend bravery was widespread when careers were on the line. Next, Jane compares today's political climate to apartheid, civil rights, and Stonewall, melodramatically asking if we'd have the courage to face hoses, batons, and dogs. Really, Jane? Equating a room full of wealthy Hollywood elites giving self-congratulatory speeches to activists literally facing death and imprisonment is offensive at best, delusional at worst. Sorry, Jane, but being criticized on Twitter isn't exactly Selma in 1965. The only hoses Hollywood celebrities encounter these days is spray Perrier backstage at the Oscars. Comparing your cushy SAG Awards ceremony to actual life or death struggles isn't bravery. It's narcissism in high definition. Now, Jane then dramatically announces we're on our documentary moment, whatever the hell that means, and insists we mustn't kid ourselves. This is big time serious. Yes, Yes, Jane, so serious that Hollywood's response is a speech at a gala celebrating actors pretending to save the world. Her entire rhetoric here is classic emotional manipulation, employing a false equivalence to scare us into believing disagreement with Hollywood's politics is equivalent to fighting violent oppression. This isn't courage. It's virtue signaling from the safety of a Beverly Hills mansion. Pretending a mean tweet is equivalent to police brutality. Finally, Jane implores us, let's be brave. Brave, Jane? Coming from an actress whose greatest risk these days is choosing between champagne brands, that advice rings about as authentic as Elizabeth Warren's Ancestry.com results. It's easy to preach bravery when your livelihood isn't actually threatened. Real bravery involves sacrifice, not delivering speeches from your luxury bubble. Maybe Jane should stick to reading scripts someone else wrote because her own narrative about Hollywood heroism is less documentary and more Hollywood fiction. Nice lighting, compelling dialogue, but absolutely zero basis in reality. The reality is Hollywood and the left absolutely love preaching from their moral high horse about being on the right side of history, but this last election hilariously proved they're riding a donkey straight off a cliff. Watching celebrities desperately endorse Kamala Harris had the same impact as Jussie Smollett at a truth-telling convention. Zero credibility, maximum cringe. After years of pushing melodramatic narratives more fake than their plastic surgeries, Hollywood's moral authority is now torched worse than California's forests under Newsom's watch. Turns out America finally realized the loudest virtue signalers aren't historical heroes. They're just cautionary tales.
This is a good time for a little Norma Ray or Karen Silkwood or Tom Joad. We must not isolate. We must stay in community. We must help the vulnerable. We must find ways to project an inspiring vision of the future, one that is beckoning, welcoming, that will help people believe that, to quote the novelist Pearl Cleage, on the other side of the conflagration, there will still be love. There will still be beauty.
Oh my God.
And there will be an ocean of truth for us to swim in. Let's make it so. Thank you for this encouragement. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jane Fonda, for blessing us with that amazing emotional meltdown. I don't know if you caught that, folks, but she was calling on us to channel Norma Ray, Karen Silkwood, and Tom Joad because obviously pretending to be a fictional hero from behind the walls of your gated mansion is exactly the same as risking your life for labor rights. Jane comparing herself to actual working class heroes is like Jussie Smollett claiming to be a civil rights martyr. Bold, absurd, and painfully detached from reality. Then Jane lectures us that we must stay in community and help the vulnerable. Yes, Hollywood, the shining example of community, where you're warmly welcomed as long as you parrot every progressive slogan perfectly. Otherwise, you're canceled quicker than Roseanne Barr at an NAACP dinner. Hollywood preaching unity is about as credible as Harvey Weinstein hosting a women's empowerment seminar, entertaining, deeply disturbing, and fundamentally hypocritical. But it gets better. Jane quotes novelist Pearl Cleage, promising us that after the conflagration, we'll swim in an ocean of truth. Really, Jane? Hollywood lecturing about truth is like Alec Baldwin offering gun safety tips. Darkly ironic and a disaster waiting to happen. The only ocean Hollywood swims in is full of Botox, fake apologies, and the tears of actors who didn't get enough Instagram likes this week. Finally, Jane thanks everyone for their encouragement. Encouragement for what exactly? Bravely reading a teleprompter while pretending your biggest struggle is deciding which private jet to take? Jane Fonda preaching bravery is like Elizabeth Warren teaching Cherokee history. Pure fiction, zero authenticity. I don't know if you noticed, but I got a bone to pick with a few different people in this episode. Anyway, sorry, Jane, but your inspirational speech about community and bravery rings about as true as Amber Heard's testimony. Next time you feel the urge to lecture us about truth, empathy, or courage, maybe take a glance at your own industry, because right now your ocean of truth is looking a lot like a Hollywood kiddie pool. Shallow, plastic, and suspiciously filled with characters who are on the Epstein list. Anyway, in case you needed any evidence as to why all the platitudes Jane gives us in this speech ring hollow, here's a look back at the 1970s when Jane went full anti-American.
But no visitor made more headlines than the actress Jane Fonda. During 2 weeks in the summer of 1972, she broadcast at least 10 times over Radio Hanoi, denouncing American POWs for having committed war crimes, urging the North Vietnamese to hold out against American imperialism. Many Americans would never forgive her for what she did and said.
According to international law, these men are war criminals. That's according to law, according to the Nuremberg principles, according to the Geneva Accord and others. They should be tried in front of a court and probably executed for what they did.
I don't think there's any way you can watch that footage and think Jane Fonda actually loves this country or has any interest in upholding our values. We're talking about a woman who, at the height of the Vietnam War, proudly posed on enemy anti-aircraft guns and enthusiastically called for American POWs to be executed for war crimes. Now, it's been decades since Fonda sat gleefully, but as this newly resurrected clip reminds us, some things age about as gracefully as Harvey Weinstein's dating history. In 1972, Jane proudly took to Radio Hanoi, branding American POWs as war criminals and cheerfully suggesting they probably should be executed. She claims quite confidently that her statements were based on international law, invoking the Geneva Accords and the Nuremberg principles. Well, let's pump the brakes here, Counselor Fonda. First off, the Nuremberg Principles addressed systematic, state-sponsored genocide and crimes against humanity, not American pilots carrying out lawful combat missions during wartime. Equating imprisoned American soldiers with literal Nazis isn't just historically ignorant, it's a vile rhetorical sleight of hand, better suited to a Soviet propaganda pamphlet than an informed discussion. And let's unpack Jane's enthusiastic call for execution a bit more, because nothing screams humanitarian like advocating summary execution of your own country's captured servicemen on enemy radio. This isn't principled activism. It's textbook treason masquerading as righteous indignation. Yet even decades later, Fonda has never fully grasped why many Americans view her as a pariah. She's bewildered by this reaction, as if publicly urging execution of POWs should be greeted with applause rather than outrage. Perhaps Jane confuses courage with actively aiding a regime notorious for torture, forced labor, and mass political executions. But I guess when you're in Hollywood, taking any stance that is anti-American is the best strategy for your career. Moreover, Jane's statements display a stunning example of the logical fallacy known as appeal to authority, where she pretends citing vaguely international-sounding terms automatically validates her treacherous rhetoric. Just because you sprinkle in terms like Geneva Accord doesn't make your baseless claims any less repugnant or ridiculous. Fonda's interpretation of international law makes less sense than Hunter Biden claiming expertise on sober living. Just because you've heard the word doesn't mean you understand them, Jane. And here's what's really ironic. Fonda now routinely frames herself as a courageous defender of human rights and compassion, yet where was that compassion when she publicly condemned American POWs, many of whom were starved, beaten, and psychologically tortured to execution? Jane conveniently forgets that real courage wasn't playing revolutionary tourist in Hanoi and being willingly used as a mouthpiece for an oppressive regime. Real courage was enduring unimaginable torture while resisting communist propaganda broadcasts, the same propaganda Jane eagerly amplified. Even today, Fonda's offenders insist she's evolved, but has she? Over the years, her basic narrative, portraying America as the world's villain, guilty by default, has barely budged. Her rhetoric now might seem gentler, more polished, carefully sanitized for Hollywood award shows, but beneath the Botox and designer activism, she's still pushing the same morally inverted worldview she broadcast over enemy airwaves in 1972. Do you doubt me? Well, here's a recent clip of Fonda on The View, expressing some very similar sentiments.
Besides marching and protesting, what else do you suggest?
Well, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not a miraculous... What did you say?
Murder. She's kidding. Wait a second. She's just kidding.
Don't say that. That's
you don't know. They'll pick up on that and just run with it.
That's the worst.
She's just kidding.
Well, let me talk to you about... Let's move on.
Jane Fonda loves nothing more than lecturing America about empathy, but you simply have to rewind the tape back a few years to see her casually suggesting murder as a viable alternative to marching and protesting. Now, I know that some defenders are already shouting at their screens, "It was just a joke." This isn't some isolated slip-up. It's classic Jane. Shock tactics followed by performative backpedaling. And even when Joy Behar desperately tried to save her from herself by shouting she's kidding, Jane responded with silence and an ice-cold stare. A look less kidding and more of, "I said what I said." That's the trouble with virtue signaling. It doesn't stand up well to playback. Fonda wants empathy from us now at the SAG Awards. Yet she showed none herself when flippantly joking about murdering her political opponents. Which, by the way, straight out of the communist playbook. Makes sense why she had such an affinity for the VC. Now, I think it's evident to anyone with half a brain cell that Jane Fonda isn't necessarily driven by genuine compassion. She's driven by applause, validation, and the moral superiority complex Hollywood elites thrive on. She'll say whatever suits the moment. Empathy at an award show, murder on daytime television. So spare us the moral lectures, Jane. Empathy isn't just a convenient buzzword you can trot around whenever you need applause. After all, preaching empathy while joking about killing political rivals isn't just hypocrisy. It's the most honest acting Jane's done in years. So as we step back from the spectacle, maybe it's worth asking ourselves, when did empathy become something celebrities conveniently wear as a designer gown? Flashy, hollow, and discarded the moment cameras turn off. What does it say about our culture when we reward empty moral posturing instead of honest, uncomfortable truths? Perhaps the real question isn't whether Jane Fonda believes her own performance, but why so many of us still buy tickets to this awful show. If empathy and virtue are nothing more than performative props wielded by the powerful, how can we ever trust those who claim to have the moral high ground? Ultimately, it's up to us to see beyond the theatrics, challenge the comfortable narratives, and decide who truly deserves our attention, and more importantly, our trust. You tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.